Edgar Snow's Red Star Over China has sold millions of copies worldwide and remains the definite Western first-hand account of the Chinese Revolution in the 1930s. In a news conference on March the 7th, China's State Councillor and Foreign Minister Huang called for more Edgar Snows for the 21st century, calling the journalist, quote, "our American friend." Snow was the first foreign journalist to visit the Red Army base in northwest China in 1936 following the Long March. He was also the first Western reporter to interview Mao Zedong, and he told the stories of Chinese revolutionaries in their own words. Why is Snow so loved and respected in China, and why has Huang put him forward as an example for other foreign journalists to follow today? Joining me from Hong Kong is Professor Daya from Hong Kong Baptist University, and from Beijing, Professor Huang Jing, Dean at the Institute of International and Regional Studies at Beijing Language and Culture University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Now, in his annual press conference on March the 7th, Chinese Foreign Minister and State Councillor Huang said that, "I hope that when reporting on China, foreign journalists will not apply any filter to their camera, either beauty or gloomy. Truthful, objective and fair stories will always appeal to people and can stand up to the scrutiny of history. China hopes to see and welcome more Edgar Snows of this new era among foreign journalists." Daya, who is Snow? Help us understand, and what was the difference between Snow and other Western journalists at his time?
Well, thank you for having me on the show. The difference is also of the period we're talking about. 1920s and 30s were a very different world. The ecosystem of journalism was very different. There were people like Mr. Snow who had sympathy for an alternative worldview which was based on socialistic ideas. And although Mr. Snow was not a communist, he didn't join the party, he was not a card holder, but he definitely had sympathies for a more socialist approach to organizing society.
Now, Huang also said Snow was not a communist, as Daya pointed out, yet when looking at the CPC, he carried no ideological bias, stayed truthful and objective, and stood by justice and his conscience. Professor Huang, why do you think Mr. Huang raised this particular point?
Yeah, because in recent years, some major mainstream media in the West try to demonize China mostly based on ideological prejudice or bias. And in this regard, they are not really objective, a lot of prejudice. And of course, some so-called journalists have not even been to the spot, but make up stories behind the closed doors with ideological bias. That's why a lot of report by the Western media does not really reflect the fact on the ground, but on the kind of story or even some, untruthful descriptions of China or some happenings in China in a very biased way, which, I think, like Councillor Huang pointed out, they are not telling people the truth or fact, but telling people a kind of story they made up with a very strong ideological bias.
Daya, by calling for more Edgar Snows during a new era, is Mr. Huang lecturing Western critics to side with China and report only its positive sides, as a British journalist has interpreted?
I think that would be a misinterpretation of what the foreign minister said, because what he meant to say was, China, like any major economy or country or civilization in China's case, is a complex story. There are things which are perhaps not very positive for an international audience, but there are lots of positive things that are happening in China. But if you're only focusing on the negative side, then there is a problem in the way you portray a particular country. And by the way, it is not a China-specific problem. I mean, think of how Iran gets covered in international media. Think of how Russia gets covered in international media. And I could go on. There are so many other cases. So with China, as my fellow panelists just mentioned, there is actually an ideological battle going on, which we describe sometimes as Cold War 2.0. So obviously China gets more than its fair share of criticism in Western media. But as I was saying, this is not just a China-specific problem. It's a global problem.
Yeah.
And it has a long history, you know.
Professor Huang, after Wang Yi's news conference, some people outside China have questioned what he said, asking such as, how would Edgar Snow report on the treatment of ethnic Uyghurs in their own homeland if he was sent to Xinjiang today? Would the party let a new Snow spend 4 months inside Zhongnanhai and interview President Xi Jinping as Snow interviewed Mao Zedong back in the day? How would you react to these questions? What do you make of these challenges?
I think that, of course, if Edgar Snow still alive today, I think he would, in my view, he would do exactly what he did many years ago. He would go to the place, he would interview the local people, including Uyghurs. He would go to Xinjiang and give people objective, fair-minded story. He would not stay in London or stay in Washington, D.C., wherever, behind the room with very strong biological bias and create a story which is totally untrue. I think that's what Edgar Snow would not do in the first place.
This quote from late Chairman Mao Zedong: when no one else was coming, Snow came here to investigate our case and to help us put the facts before the world. Now, Daya, what do you think drove Snow to explore and present China and the Communist Party, even at the risk of his own life? Is that spirit still alive somewhere here, somewhere today?
Mr. Snow was an unusual personality, and he had to suffer for his pro-China sympathies when he went back to the United States under McCarthy's, you know, sort of anti-China, anti-communist crusade. He had to actually leave the United States. As you probably know, he settled in Switzerland. So, you know, he's in many ways an exceptional journalist. And I'm sure in today's much more complex media economy, there are individuals who, you know, take that kind of detailed, much more grounded journalism very seriously. So I'm sure there are some Snows, you know, working in China, looking at stories from a different perspective. But whether they get to the mainstream media is the question. More often than not, they don't.
Finally, Professor Huang, is there any chance that not just another Snow comes up, but also another publishing house or media, such as the Victor Goland's publishing house that published the Red Star Over China firstly, or the China Weekly Review that was bold enough to publish Snow's interview with Mao Zedong verbatim, you know? Do you think there are the chances that there are publishing houses, there are media that have the courage to show these and say, let's take a look at what was really being said without putting on some ideological glasses?
Given the circumstances right now, I would doubt nowadays not only the so-called anti-China or demonized China has become so-called political correctness in the mainstream Western media, but also the time has changed. Right now, all the media world is very much controlled by the capitals. And capitalism has a much deeper and widespread you know, manipulation of the media story. So whoever dares to do this may have been, you know, in shortage of funding. But anyway, even having said that, we still have seen some very, you know, fair-minded Western journalists to do the right thing. But they're not the majority. That's a problem.
Yeah. Well, we also have guests and friends who appear on CGTN on our show, like today, to speak up for what they believe is the right thing to do. So many thanks to Professor Daya Thussu from Hong Kong Baptist University, and of course, many thanks to Professor Huang Jing, Dean at the Institute of International and Regional Studies from Beijing Language and Culture University.